To say we're being hosted tonight by Danny Pike from BBC Sussex, and we look forward to an interesting and challenging debate on the rise of elder exploitation, particularly fraud, and how we should tackle it. Before I hand over to Danny, though, I think it's probably appropriate to say just a very few words about the events in Westminster. Yesterday's brutal attack on the public, police and Parliament has sickened and saddened our nation. But it has not weakened our resolve to defeat terrorism. It has strengthened it. So at some point tonight, let's spare a thought to think of those affected yesterday and to thank those in the emergency services whose first actions are always to protect us and who yesterday paid the ultimate price in doing just that. Now let me say a very warm welcome to Danny and a huge thank you also to BBC Sussex, who've been featuring fraud and elder exploitation on their news bulletins and in Danny's programme all week. Danny, we're in your hands tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, everyone. The thing that really will stick with me from the stories we've told this week on the programme was two 80-year-old sisters who live in Worthing, and their troubles started when they were looking for a gardener. Soon after that, they had a series of men knocking at the door, sweet-talking them, out of thousands of pounds. And the level of control that these men had them under was incredible. So when their bank manager came to their house, now who sees a bank manager these days? The bank manager came to their house and said, "What's with all this money going out?" And they felt they had to lie to their bank manager and say they were just taking it out for their grandchildren. This is the level of control these criminals, these merciless criminals, will exert over our older people if we let them. So that will stick with me today. And why are they doing it here? Well, how about this? In East Sussex, almost 24% of the population is over 65, which is substantially higher than the national average of 17. So we're on 24%, nationally average at 17. And the proportion of residents over 75 is higher than in any other county in England and Wales. So the crooks are seeing pound signs before their eyes. How do we stop them and keep the money where it belongs? We're going to answer that question tonight and hopefully take some actions away. Of course, we'll open the floor to your questions a bit later on. If you're watching us on Facebook, on the Police and Crime Commissioner Facebook page, then your comments very welcome, and we'll use your emoticons to vote a little bit later on. But first of all, should we meet our panel? First of all, please welcome the Divisional Commander for Brighton, Lisa Bell.
Very nice welcome. I wasn't expecting applause so early in events. So thank you very much for that introduction. My current role is that of Divisional Commander, Brighton and Hove Division, having taken up post in November last year. So I'm still the new girl on the block. So I'm absolutely delighted to have been invited to participate in the debate this evening. One of my additional roles and responsibilities within Sussex Police is the Equality Champion for older people. So again, there's an obvious link as to why I'm been invited to be on the panel this evening, I hope. I've also had the huge privilege of working alongside people like Bernadette Laurie, who works for the force, Kevin Brown, one of my team here, who is our Public Engagement Officer, and have been really instrumental in driving some of the work forward that Sussex Police has been involved in, particularly with the Elders Commission that was obviously very successfully established by the Police and Crime Commissioner. So really looking forward to the debate this evening and hopefully being part of looking for new solutions to a very complex and tricky problem.
Thank you, Lisa. Sitting to Lisa's left on the panel this evening is a man I've spoken to on the radio a lot, but I don't think we've ever met face to face. So tonight was an unpleasant shock for you, John. This is the chair of Sussex Neighbourhood Watch, John Wright.
Thank you. You don't have to do that. Very privileged and honoured to be here. What is Neighbourhood Watch? Neighbourhood Watch is about people that care about their community. Good citizenship, reducing crime, reducing the fear of crime, keeping people safe. And I think yesterday's events show how important it is. We were formed over 30 years ago. Our focus was then on burglary. Times and crimes have changed. We've also helped burglaries fall by 25% in recent years. But the new modern Neighbourhood Watch is looking at repeating this success with modern crimes such as fraud and elder abuse. We can't do this alone because we have good partners, working together with key allies. Allies? Yeah, whatever. We're a national charity, the largest voluntary organisation in the country. We have no staff, we're all volunteers. Together we fight crime, because no one organisation can do that, and the whole community needs to be involved. And it is about your communities, about winning your communities back. And Neighbourhood Watch sets its goals on getting the communities back to a much safer place. That's what we're about. In Sussex, we have over 128,000 homes, which equates to around about 500,000 people that care about their society. You're here tonight because you care, and I applaud you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And sitting to John's left is the National Trading Standards Scams Team Manager, Louise Baxter.
Thank you. Within the National Trading Standards Scams team, there's sort of 3 strands that we tend to focus on. The first is the proactive identification of scam victims. Only 5% of people report this as a crime, and that's because of the shame, the fact that they don't realise that they are a victim of a crime. You talked about those ladies. It's coercion. It's grooming for adults, and then their personal details are trafficked through organised crime groups. So I think there's something around the language that we use in this space to actually talk about the fact this is a £10 billion problem, and that the effects of it are devastating to not only the people that are the victims, but also their family members and the society, actually. So we look at seizing what the suckers list is a horrible term, but actually it's what the criminals call them. So we look at seizing those to proactively identify the victims. We do campaigning around Friends Against Scams so that we are driving it back to communities to build community resilience, to get people talking about scams and to take away the shame element. And the best bit of the work that we do in relation to this is to investigate and disrupt these organised crime groups, to stop the mail getting into the system, but also to hit them in the pocket and to see if we can stop them from actually carrying out these crimes.
Thank you very much. And sitting to Louise's left is Phil Mawhinney, who's the Age UK Policy Manager for Consumer and Community. Phil Mawhinney.
Thank you. My name is Phil Mawhinney. I work for the charity Age UK, the national older people's charity. We have over 150 local Age UKs, including in East Sussex locally, which I know is doing a lot of work with scam victims. Just at the top, I think it's good to emphasise loneliness and isolation as one of the factors that but means that people often become victims of scams. It's already been said, but I think it's worth reinforcing. There are over 1.2 million older people who are chronically lonely, and people go for weeks and weeks without having anyone to talk to, and I think that can be quite hard for us to imagine if we're in work, if we have family. We just talk to people every day without even thinking about it. And so to try and imagine people who don't have anyone to talk to, I think is really important, because we know that fraudsters prey on that. As Louise says, they groom people because they know that people are desperate for a conversation. This happens with doorstep scammers, as we've heard. Romance scams, we might talk about tonight as well, really links to that. Even things like investment fraud. So I think loneliness is a big part of this. It's obviously a big challenge. In terms of the impacts that scams have on people, obviously there's the financial impacts. Some people lose their life savings, which they've worked very hard for decades, and so I think it's worth trying to remember the impact of that. Not only you've lost all of your money, which can be huge amounts, but also it's everything that you've worked for. Linked to that, there are psychological impacts that people have. Often people lose trust, they lose confidence, and then their physical health deteriorates as well. This happens quite a lot. This can mean that people need support from hospitals, care, which they maybe didn't need before, and so there's pressure on the state there, which didn't happen before. And then in terms of the support that people need, it has to mirror that. We have to help people financially, make sure that they're claiming everything they're entitled to, try as best as we can to get them back onto their feet. Of course, one of the problems with older people is that they may not have the chance to work. If they've already finished working, they may not have the same chance to build up their resources again. And we need to make sure that there's meaningful help for people in terms of the psychological trauma, counselling, but also the health impacts and the social impacts as well. Again, isolation, loneliness. I think one of the ways to help people get over it is to make sure they're reconnected in the community, with volunteers, with befrienders, just that they don't keep being isolated. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, very much indeed. And sitting just to my right, very pleased to have with us two people from the money handling industry. Mainly they're sitting next to me so I can keep an eye on them. But I'll ask them to introduce themselves. First of all, Barclays Strategic Transformation Leader and the Vulnerable Customer Team. This is Laura Flack, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Well, first of all, I thought, wow, what a corporate title I have down there. So maybe I'll just share a little bit about my role and what I do for Barclays. So I'm actually head of our scam prevention agenda, working within our customer vulnerability team. So myself, I've worked for Barclays for 10 years now. I started off working within our branch network, so I have worked within our branches, helping our customers day to day to understand what our frontline colleagues do to help protect people, but also in terms of moving on to other roles through digital. And also then moving on to strategic transformation role. Why are we here today? I suppose every day people are targeted by fraudsters, but essentially, those in customers in vulnerable circumstances specifically. So what we would like to do is to demonstrate some of the things that we are doing in this space to both raise awareness with the public, to support our colleagues through training to help identify customers that are in a vulnerable circumstance, those that may be falling victim to frauds, scams and financial abuse, and to talk about how I suppose we can work more collaboratively to work better together, whether that's with law enforcement agencies, other financial institutions, working better to share information, to fight the fraudsters and to crack down together.
Thank you, and welcome along. And finally, the Director of MoneyGram International, this is Keith Sharp, everybody.
I'd like to quite amend that. I'm not the director of the whole company.
You are now, because I said you are. It's too late.
Can you let my boss know?
Yeah, we'll do. I'll pass that up the chain.
Yes, I'm the director of the group security team. Part of my role is liaison with law enforcement. But for those who don't know MoneyGram, we're a money transfer company that are in over 200 countries around the world. We have millions of individual customers, and over the course of a year we will transfer over hundreds of millions of dollars, pounds, euros to those countries. Primarily our service is for friends, relatives, loved ones to transfer money across the globe when you've got someone in the UK working here and wants to send money back to Pakistan or to support their family. That's our primary purpose. We spend a huge amount of money per year on compliance programs to try and prevent our systems being abused by criminals. We do have all kinds of programs, training programs for our agents, and we have controls across our systems to try and prevent these transactions going through. But my role in all of this, or part of my role, is to reach out with law enforcement. And as Louise says, working with law enforcement and other agencies is our best way forward, because what we want to achieve is to prevent it happening. It's all very well law enforcement contacting us after someone's been a victim. We can do something about that. We can prevent them from transferring money with us again, and we can stop the people that have received the money. But we would like to get in front of that. And part of that, Louise mentioned the mugs list, or I'm not sure, the suckers list. For various legislative reasons, we can't have that. But if we could prevent those people from using our systems in the first place. And I think that would be a huge step forward. But I'd be interested to hear some of the questions that come out tonight, and look forward to an interesting evening, I think it may be.
Oh, I think it's going to be. Right, we'll get into the debate then. We'll do about 40 minutes of this, and then there'll be time for your questions we'll get to later. And once again, good evening to everyone watching on Facebook. We'd love to hear your comments tonight. So first of all, when we were talking earlier in the week, Katie, about this, I think there's a lack of clarity around all of this area. So quite soft-sounding terms like scams or cons or frauds or fraudsters. Can we agree on some terms tonight on what we call this kind of crime? Is it theft, are these criminals?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think some of the messaging around it is very muddled for people, and I do think there's a danger when we refer to scam that people feel that that is something that only happens to someone who's stupid. And so it almost prevents them from wanting to report a crime because they feel that if they phone the police, they'll be making a fuss unnecessarily. I've always said that just because somebody's smooth-talking your grandmother down the phone and robbing her of her life savings doesn't make it any less serious than if they've mugged her in the street. And by calling it a scam, are we undermining the severity of this crime?
Phil, do you want to come in on that? What sort of language do you think would be really useful to help older people explain what's happening to them? How should we couch this?
I mean, I wouldn't want to get too bogged down in language because there's pros and cons to both. I think a lot of people recognise the term scam and it sort of rings true with people.
But it's a bit soft, isn't it?
Can be a bit soft, but people know what it means. But I would echo what's already been said, that it can imply that it's something small that people should have known better. And we would disagree with that, and we would encourage people, if they have been scammed, to appreciate that they're not the only ones. It happens to people of all ages. Obviously, we're talking about older people, but it's not limited to older people. I think the term fraud, it doesn't always ring true with people because they think of a big institution being defrauded. But at the same time, it maybe has a bit more gravitas, or it maybe reflects the severity of the crime a little bit more. So I wouldn't get too bogged down in language, but I would repeat that it's a crime and people shouldn't feel that it's their own fault.
Lisa Bell, how would you like to hear about this sort of crime when it comes to you? How should people describe it to you?
Well, I guess, one of the key straplines is, we often promote the words around, scams are fraud, frauds are crime, and
That's three different terms.
It's just keeping it really simple in terms of, we in the police do not recognise scams as a crime type. It is really simply theft or fraud is what we are talking about here. And I think the more important point for me was the issue around people not feeling that they want to come forward, not recognising that they have been a victim. And I think it's getting over the stigma. You are no less a victim if you have been defrauded than you are, as Katie said, that you've been mugged and assaulted in the street. So I think there's this unhelpful differentiation in terms of how people view them. And in policing terms, it's really simple. It's our job to prevent and investigate crime. And actually, being a victim of crime is nobody's fault, and it certainly isn't the fault of the victim. And all I want to sort of reassure people tonight is that we will absolutely take this seriously. There is no suggestion that we will add to the embarrassment or the difficulties or the shame that people feel when they come to us. And I think that's testament to the work of Bernadette amongst many other of our colleagues and partners in terms of really overcoming some of the stigma that people feel around this. So the message from me is it is absolutely crime. Crime is our business, and you bring that to our door.
Okay, well, maybe a kind of a consensus will evolve during the course of the evening. I wanted to talk about how we protect then older residents from harm in this way. 20, 30 years ago, perhaps fear of burglary might have been a bit, somebody bashing your window, nicking your brand new VHS video recorder. This is much more subtle in many ways. So, John Wright from Neighbourhood Watch, how should people in neighbourhoods look out for each other these days as opposed to the past?
People have to be more vigilant. They've got to be more aware. They've got to start talking to the neighbours. Years ago, and everybody, the elderly would know that you could go next door and borrow sugar and all that scenario. Today's world has changed, people have changed, attitudes have changed. And I think we have to all get that on board and literally start looking after each other, because that neighbour next door, and we found out ourselves within Neighbourhood Watch, is that some people don't even talk to their neighbour. They don't know their neighbour because they don't want to know their neighbour, because it's about protection of themselves rather than their community. And that's what we're trying to break. And we're saying to people, if you're going out in the morning and you see your neighbour, say hello today. Next week, it could be, hello, how are you? Over a month, you'll start talking. And that, to me, is what it is about in the community. Each street, road, close, wherever you live, you will know somebody that's vulnerable, that's elderly, and maybe not have any family. I don't know. All I'm asking is, we ask our people, our volunteers, is that you know them, try and help them, make contact with them, make them feel safe.
What about when you see, you know, like the ladies I was talking about at the top of the debate, who have a series of people coming to their doors? Neighbours must see these people that aren't neighbours, who don't live on the street, who don't recognise them. They might see a procession of people turning up at somebody's door, and they take no action. Why is that?
But we do take action, and we say to our members that if you see a van or somebody walking up and down, or we had an instance only the other week where somebody was doing what he shouldn't have been doing into a bush. Okay? I'm trying to be polite. But that person was seen. Why he stopped outside a particular house, all he was doing was actually looking at the house. Moved the van 10 yards down and was doing the same thing. Somebody realised and rang the police and said, we have somebody is suspicious to this area. And this comes back to being vigilant, looking out, and you know your neighbourhood. If you're going on holiday, park and you've got a spare drive, get your neighbours to park a car on your drive so it always looks as if somebody's at home.
Okay. This is one for Louise Baxter, National Trading Standards Scams Team Manager. Could you set out the kind of scams and frauds that you see most regularly? What are the ones that are people most vulnerable to?
The ones that we come across mainly are mail scams, so clairvoyant scams, prize draw scams, fake lottery scams.
People still fall for that?
A huge amount of people. We call them the silent victims of crime because it happens behind closed doors, so people don't see that they're receiving. We had one victim who was getting 56 pieces of post a day, scam mail, because once you've responded to one, you get added to the suckers list and it gets sold on.
But who's going into the home and seeing that pile of 56 letters?
Well,
somebody must be,
but you would think that, but not always, because sometimes these people are, they're not financially excluded, they're not on the radar of adult social care or of any other organisation, so they could be completely socially isolated. The family members, they may be estranged, or they may not realise that this is actually scam mail. They may think it's junk mail, which again is terminology that we shouldn't use because it's not junk, it's criminal mail that's coming through the letterbox. And also there's sometimes this difficulty because of the language that's used and the fact that a lot of our victims will see receiving the mail as their serving a purpose. It fills their day. When people have retired and they could have been a professional in their working life, it becomes something that becomes part of their daily routine. So they look forward to receiving the post, they process all of it, and they've been told via the letters and via the telephone that they've definitely won and their prize is on the way.
Same with these smooth-talking people on the telephone
It's
as well.
exactly the
You
same.
can have a 10-minute, 15-minute conversation and be delighted to have that with
The
you.
clairvoyant scams are absolutely horrendous to the fact that they will say you need to send us £20 for a lucky talisman or to fill the force from the paper or your children will die and your house will burn down. So you've got an 80-year-old lady who lives on her own, who hasn't got anybody to talk to, who's getting bombarded by 50 letters a day. We've had people tin foil up the front of their houses because to keep the bad spirits away, and continually sending money to these criminals who are exploiting people who aren't vulnerable people, but they're vulnerable because of their circumstances. They're vulnerable because they are living alone or they're socially isolated.
And from the criminal's point of view, that is really low risk, isn't it?
No, absolutely. It's all coming from abroad. So it's
All of
not-
it?
Yeah,
Or is some of it-
99.9% of it's coming from abroad.
Right.
If it's coming within the UK, we shut that down straight away. But it's all coming from abroad. So we try to work internationally to try and stop it from getting into the country, but it's very, very difficult to track them down.
How about the romance side of things? I mean, not us, but I mean, yet.
And there's an offer.
That was mentioned earlier in the debates, that the romance scams. How are
Romance
they?
scams, again, that can be started. We had an 82-year-old lady who was on Facebook. So, again, she was internet savvy. So, again, it's not a case of people not accessing the internet as well. And she was approached by a chap who was allegedly an ex-soldier from America who was allegedly 58. My first thing was like high five to the 82-year-old lady because she was being chatted up. Well done. And they ended up having a relationship, an internet relationship. And then it always comes down to the crux of it. Oh, I need money for an airplane ticket. Or my daughter's sick. I need to pay for some hospital bills. Oh, shall I transfer the money directly to the hospital? No, give it to me because they won't accept the money from you. She ended up losing £20,000. So, and then the romance scams are harder to unpick because actually, if you're in for £100,000 or in for £20,000 and that person is actually giving you somebody to talk to, making you feel loved, you feel like you're in a relationship, and I come in as trading standards or the police come in and go, this is all a scam. Can you, to actually realise that and to accept that, actually I'd probably keep spending the £100 a week if I had it, rather than accepting that I was a victim.
Okay, and Laura Flack from Barclays, I mean, you know, in the last few years, people have had access to their pension pots. So how are you protecting customers who maybe have suddenly come into £50,000 or £60,000?
Yeah, definitely. So we're looking at supporting across to ensure that anyone that wishes to make any kind of large transaction, so say, for example, they come into branch wishing to undertake a large transfer, to look at investing it elsewhere, then actually our colleagues are trained to have a discussion at this point in time to understand whether there's any kind of unusual activity taking place, whether this transaction is out of character for them. We can obviously try to understand who it is they're transferring the money to, whether they've done their due diligence around where they're about to send their life savings to. So actually it gives us a really good, I suppose, point of intervention if they come in and speak to us. We're also doing proactive pieces around reaching out to customers directly, making them aware, obviously, of the changes that are coming into play, letting them know around the scams that are out there and what they can do to protect their money, making sure that they do check those companies, being able to go online to the fraud and scam smart hubs to do the due diligence around those companies to make sure that they are genuine companies and that they are not scammers. Not only that, we've heavily invested in our systems to ensure that we have multi-layer security. We are continuously doing automatic payment profiling, so not just reliant on our frontline colleagues, but also around our systems as well.
Yeah, if I suddenly have the whim to go to Liverpool one day and use my credit card up there, I might get a call from the bank just to say, is it still in your possession? Is there a way you can do that with perhaps people, I don't know, over a certain age or whatever it is, I don't know how you want to define it, to say if there is suddenly a flurry of activity, it would flag up automatically?
So we are looking at doing a lot in the data analytics space to be able to empower our customers to do more around, well, actually, what is an unusual transaction for Danny, for example, understanding actually those usual places that you do use your cards, spend your money, those branches that you may go into, so that way we can understand what is abnormal for you. As you said, in terms of the fraud piece, we do obviously send out the text alert messages. We're trying to I suppose do a lot around the education piece, around when people receive these text messages, what they can do to not just say, is it you? Well, yes, obviously it is me if it's a scam. I suppose it's probably worth just noting from a bank perspective, we use the word fraud, we use the word scam. Both of these are unlawful. Fraud is where someone's money is hacked, stolen, taken, but actually a scam is where the individual is coerced into doing that transfer, in essence, giving their money away. So that's why it's really important when we have a conversation with a customer around that transaction to dig a little bit deeper into it. Because if I turn around and said, you know, Danny, is that you that's making that transfer? And you said, well, yes, it is. Well, actually, great. But actually, do you know who you're sending it to, where it's going, and asking a little bit more around it, particularly in that scam pension place that you mentioned?
Yeah, so even I'm scared now. Phil Mawini, when we're talking to people, members of Age UK, do you think the message is clear? Do people understand the threat?
Which meant just the general message?
Yeah, I mean, this talk about whether it's scams or fraud, or do people understand the kind of threats that Louise was talking about?
I mean, it's a mixed picture. Older people aren't all the same. Some people are very highly attuned to the threat and very plugged in. Some people will be much less aware. I think one of the challenges is that scams change all the time. So once we clamp down on one, then another one pops up. And people are different, you know. Some people are online, they know what to look out for, they're connected to the community. Some people aren't online, some people are completely isolated. So it varies, but I think the point is that scams change all the time, and a lot of them are very sophisticated, and they're not necessarily that obvious. Clearly, if they were obvious, then it would be easier to tackle. And even some of the ones that might make you feel like, well, why did this person not realize it was a scam? I think it comes back to loneliness. I'm going to reinforce one of my earlier points already. And I think until you're in that position where you're completely alone and you've had difficult experiences in your life, like you've been bereaved, you've become ill, I think it's really hard to imagine what that is like until you're in it. And it's very clear that those catastrophic circumstances often make people much more at risk than they were 5 years previously.
We do quite a lot on the phone about this kind of crime, and what amazes me is each time we talk about it, people will come on to me and say, oh yeah, I get phone calls at 6:15 in the evening, I always have a little chat with them. And I say, well no, we'll just put the phone down straight away. How do we change that kind of thinking? Because people don't want to be rude, it's not how they were brought up, it's not the person they are. But actually, it's so alien to people to go, shut up, I don't know who you are, bosh, the phone goes down. How do we change that?
I mean, again, coming back to loneliness, I will talk about other things as well, but I'm going to guess that you have people to chat to every day. You've got colleagues, you're here in the library tonight, so your reaction on the phone is very different from what it would be if you didn't have anyone, if you were at home all day by yourself, if you were a bit older. So there's a risk that we put our own reactions onto other people and we say, well, why didn't you do this, when we don't really understand what their living scenario is.
I might be lonely, but I definitely wouldn't want to be talked out of my money.
But they're really clever marketers. They're not people, they don't phone and shout at you, give me all your money. They're like your mate. And when you talk to some of the victims that we come across, they'll refer to the criminals as their friends. My friend John, he's given me a really good investment opportunity. He's given me really good advice. And they do become their friends. That's the problem with it.
Let's bring Keith Sharp in from MoneyGram. Thanks for coming, and do appreciate it. But money transferring in the way that businesses like yours operate seems to be a great vehicle for these criminals to get the money out of this country to them. How does it actually work?
Right, it's a fairly straightforward system actually. We're in over 200 countries around the world.
Yeah.
In the UK we've got over 13,000 agents, the vast majority of which are in post offices. But effectively, in simple terms, you walk into one of our agents with the money that you want to transfer, some identity documents, you tell them who you want to transfer it to, they give you an 8-figure money transaction number, they take the money from you, you call the person that you want to send the money to, give them the 8-figure number, they go into a MoneyGram agent in whichever country that they're in, quote the transaction number with their identity documents and pick the money up. That's the simple version.
Yeah, that's where the whole thing falls down, isn't it? Because once you've got that 8-figure number, the money's yours. Because right? You're checking the identity of the person who's sending it.
Yep.
Are you checking the identity of the person who's picking it up?
Yep. Yeah, you can't pick it up without identity.
Right. Whether that be a forged
or
whatever.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's forgeries out there. We train our agents to look out for forgeries, but they're agents. They're not. They don't just deal with money transfers. A lot of them in the post office, they'll be selling stamps and posting letters and this, that, and the other. And we have them in shops and Tesco's. So it's not their primary business. It's a bolt-on business to an existing business. So they're not experts in handling money. However, we have internal training programs. Before you become an agent, you have to do an exam, you have to pass that exam, and you have to pass it every year. And if we see issues, we've got myriad ways of monitoring our systems and looking at where money's being transferred, who's transferring it. And we look at agents individually. And if we see something wrong with how an agent is doing the transfer, then we will go and intervene, speak to the agent, And obviously, if there's an issue with that agent, we'll take it further, or we may train them. But our first line of defence, as far as that is concerned, is an agent. So if you walk in we're talking about elderly and vulnerable people here. So if an elderly person walks in, we would expect our agent to ask them pertinent questions. You used an interesting word earlier about control. We have found, and I'm sure this will be backed up by members on the board, that these people can control the victims, and they will tell a story to our agents. Our agents, if an old person came in and says, I want to send £5,000 to, doesn't matter where, any country, we would expect our agent to say, why? Why are you sending that? They are socially engineered or made, they're given a story because the criminals know that we're going to ask those questions. So they will supply the answers that the victim has to give. So they will tell our agent, oh, it's for my grandson who's in whatever country he's travelling. Doesn't matter really what the story is, as long as it's a plausible story. So you've then got a situation, and I'm sure this is a similar situation to what happens in the banks, you've then got our agent or a bank operative. How far do you go in questioning a person who wants to send money?
Yeah,
if they tell you it's my friend or a legitimate story as to why they want to transfer that money, you say, are you sure it's your friend? Yes.
Yeah, and they keep saying yes, eventually you've got to send it.
Yeah.
But also you're asking a lot of somebody who's running maybe a corner shop and is selling milk, bread. Oh, and by the way, are you sure you're not being ripped off for this £5 grand?
Absolutely, but we have other controls in place. Assuming that they pass that test and that they've given a good enough story that the money is going to be transferred. So the agent takes it in and it goes into our system. Our systems are divided up, we call them corridors. So from the UK, every country that you can send money to is a corridor. So if it was UK to France, UK to USA. And those corridors we can control. We can put restrictions on each corridor. So across the world we've got hundreds of corridors. So we can put a control on it. So if we were seeing a lot of fraud going to a particular country, we can limit the transactions, the value of the transactions that are going to that country. So a transaction goes in, say it is for £5,000, and it gets held in our system. Say it was going to France, just as an example. And we had a restriction in that you could only send £600 to France. It gets held in our system, and we've got call centres around the globe that they will call you and ask you why you're sending that money. And if they ask much tougher questions than an agent does. And if there's any doubt as to whether that transaction is in any way unlawful for criminal purpose, we'll tell the customer, we're not going to complete the transaction, go back to the agent, collect your money and the fees.
But it's not foolproof because we know people are sending vast sums of money.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the other end of things, Lisa Bell from Sussex Police, the divisional commander in Brighton, when somebody reports a crime like this and say, yeah, I did go down to the local money transfer place and I sent £5,000 off and it went to France, and the person who turned up at the other end with the 8-figure number and the ID to collect it, how easy is that for you as a Sussex police force to track down that criminal at the other end in France?
Oh, you've asked me that dreaded question. You really need one of my investigators here. But I mean, in reality, we have good international connections across all areas of law enforcement, including policing. And I'm going to desperately look at Bernadette in a minute to see if she's going to assist me with this. But I think in terms of recognising the changing nature of this crime, we recognise that it is borderless. So we're not operating as Sussex Police in isolation. We're not operating within the confines of the UK. So we recognise that those connections need to exist, and they do. So I don't know whether Bernadette...
Bernadette, would you like to come up and just stand in front of this microphone and introduce yourself to everybody? Just in the middle here, if you don't mind joining us. Is that all right? Sorry to pounce on you, but it was Lisa's fault.
It was, and I did, to be fair, I did warn her that when it came to the really difficult technical questions...
So yeah, maybe just stand by the desk there and kind of... Oh, there's a microphone. Thank you very much, Ellie. Cheers. So just introduce yourself to everybody on Facebook and in the room, if you would, please. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Bernadette Laurie and I'm the Financial Abuse Safeguarding Officer for Sussex Police. And in answer to the question around MoneyGram, when the...
Sorry, money transfer supplies, we should say. I'm not picking on Keith particularly. But
not just MoneyGram. Yeah, there are others. And Western Union's probably the other one that we see the most of. Now, when somebody transfers that money and gets that 8-figure digit and takes it, effectively it's gone. It's like cash. They've just walked into an outlet in a foreign country and they've picked up the money and it's gone. If it was being held, we have opportunities, and I have worked with Keith before, to get it back within a very short space of time. But once that transaction has been collected the other end, it's gone.
So no local force with CCTV, as you'd investigate a theft here of money, the local force in France, for instance, wouldn't investigate that for you?
The reality with the kind of crimes we're talking about, France probably wasn't the best example of a country.
It wasn't, but I didn't want to be
okay,
unfair.
To whichever country it is.
So essentially, the countries that most of this money is going out to are not countries that we have a great relationship with law enforcement-wise, and we do have reservations as to how thorough the checks on the ID and things like that are that end as well. So effectively, unfortunately, from an investigative point of view, once it's gone, it's gone. From a prevention point of view, however, we do have measures in place, so we can identify those victims that are sending, and then, like Keith said, we can put a block on them. So particularly the ones, like Louise mentioned, for romance frauds, when they're still embroiled in it and they would carry on sending that money, we can stop them from doing that by putting that block in place.
Okay, so I think from that, we're going to say you've got to stop the money going in the first place, because it's as good as gone. Once it's gone.
Right.
Okay, Bernadette, thank you. I might ask you up again in a minute, so thank you very much, Bernadette. Okay, so elder exploitation, are we taking it seriously enough? Let's just go down the panel with that. Katie Bourne, the Police and Crime Commissioner, you called this meeting. You're why we're all here.
Thanks for that, Danny. Blame me. Actually, I'm going to blame the Elders Commission that I set up. And there are many members here tonight, and I'm really delighted that they're with us. So about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, I set up a group of 30 people in Sussex who were over the age of 65. And the idea with the Elders Commission was that they would go back into their communities and speak to other people similar age to themselves and ask them how they felt about policing and whether they felt safe and what the issues were. And what we found really that quite alarmed me was that nearly 20% of the conversations that they'd had, people said that they were really frightened when the telephone rang from fraud that was happening and being perpetrated down the phone than they were of actual antisocial behaviour on the streets. And so actually, from my point of view, it then made me ask questions, and I then got to meet Bernadette, who does an amazing job in Sussex Police and has almost single-handedly set up Operation Signature, which is Sussex Police's response to this sort of fraud amongst our elderly. But the interesting thing, and what worries me, is that other police forces aren't taking it as seriously, and they're not putting the resources into this, which clearly these types of crimes need. And we know that, and Bernadette can tell you some quite worrying stories. So fraud at the moment is collected nationally by Action Fraud, run by the City of London Police. And all reports are held in this one big database. And then every so many weeks, I think it's 6 weeks, they do almost a data dump, if you like, amongst forces around the country. And the forces pick up this information. Well, first of all, this is information about victims who've been defrauded in the county. But it's 6 weeks out of date, which is a real problem, as you've just heard, because that doesn't help with investigations. And sometimes the forces aren't even looking at them, because City of London will crime them, but the actual force, when they arrive, they will say, well, it hasn't happened, you know, it's been crimed already, and therefore they don't necessarily deal with it because it's almost in the too difficult box, because they have to then go through each one of those crimes and individually pull them out, and that's what Bernadette and her team do in Sussex under Operation Signature. Now, we've raised this as a real issue nationally, and we will continue to bash on about this, but I do worry that other police forces up and down the country have no idea that in this basket of data that they've got, there are very vulnerable victims who are being defrauded of large sums of money, and potentially they're victims of other crimes as well.
Okay. And Lisa Bell, you and Bernadette have said how seriously you take these crimes. Do you have the time and resources to investigate them and stop them?
I think that the scale of it, really, I mean, Bernadette and others have talked about the hidden nature of this. So I think at the moment we don't truly understand what the level of demand is. So I think as a consequence that if we did really fully understand, you know, how much crime of this type has been committed, then the force would need to make some very serious investment decisions in terms of did we have the sufficient numbers of staff with the right skills and experience to investigate these, to make sure that we get more prosecutions. I mean, I think Sussex as a force is in a hugely fortunate position that Operation Signature is viewed sort of nationally as good practice. And I think what I see on a day-to-day basis around recognising vulnerability in older people does play out in some of our practices as well. So, for example, we have a resolution centre in force which will deal with quite a significant chunk of crime that's reported to us, and often that will be dealt with over the phone and won't involve a personal visit. We've made a really conscious decision to make sure that any kind of crime of this type doesn't go through our resolution centre and it's followed up with a personal contact, face-to-face visit, because in terms of understanding the full picture of vulnerability, whether or not it's around older people, whether or not it's in the context of domestic abuse, you will not be able to pick up all the signs and signals by operating remotely. So I think from a force perspective, the more we understand, the more that's reported to us, whether it's directly or through other organisations, the better position that we're in to understand what it is we need in order to be more effective.
How about this? Would you like some more money? Because if I understand it correctly, if you police an area where there's lots of pubs and nightclubs and at 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock a.m. they're throwing out lots of drunk people, you can get more money to police that. Considering our older population in this area who aren't crawling out of pubs at 11 o'clock but are perhaps being stolen from in their own homes, would more money be helpful?
If I can answer that one, because obviously the budget tends to land at my door unhelpfully. It's not necessarily having the more money, it's actually how you're directing the resources that you've got. And our force is aware of this. I think that now the crime fraud is recorded, it's pushed up by about 3 million crimes annually. Now, if these 3 million crimes are coming back to forces, do they know who those victims are within their forces? Are they putting the resources into that, or are they focused elsewhere? And I think that, for me, is a big issue. The government are currently looking at the funding formula for the police grant, how much they're going to give us, and I am speaking to Home Office ministers very strongly around this, saying we need to be looking at elder exploitation and fraud as a crime type. So when you are deciding how you're going to distribute funding, don't just count the bars, because, well, mind you, a lot of our 65-year-olds are capable of going out and smashing a few if they need to, but and having a good time, because we all live to be at least 100 in Sussex. That's why we're all here. But at the end of the day, are they really taking this into account when they're rewriting our funding formula for police forces? Because we have an increasingly elderly population.
The Home Secretary is a Sussex MP. Does she understand this issue? Have you spoken to her about it?
I have spoken to her about it, and I will continue to speak to her and the Policing Minister about it.
Okay, thank you. Phil Mawini, would you like to tell us whether you think we're taking this kind of crime against elderly people seriously enough?
Yes.
Sorry, I was looking at John and I said Phil, but that's me for you. We're coming down the panel. John, I beg your pardon.
Turned you on. Are we taking it serious enough? I don't think we were. I think we're beginning to take it more serious now than what we've ever done. What we're trying to do, and I think, Bernadette, I know the role you do, we've known each other for years, and I think you do a superb job, and I think you ought to be promoted. I really do.
You do a swap.
Kate.
She knew the answer to the other question better than I.
And I seriously mean that. What we've done in Crawley, because of this, and we started this 6 months ago, is that we piloted in Crawley to go around the wards of the town and to the forums, and what we're now doing is a presentation about scams, frauds, showing videos from Bernadette, to try and raise the bar, if you like, and to show people what actually is going on. And it's a pilot scheme we've done. We've done certainly half of Crawley already at the forums. It's gone down exceptionally well. We are now going to roll that out across Sussex, which Derek and I, my deputy, will lead, because it is about raising awareness. We have an excellent relationship with the PCC, with Katie. We don't have a relationship, but we have a good working relationship. I just wanted to put that right. You know, we have an extremely good relationship with Sussex Police. We're a very strong partner, and we do work together. We want now to work better and more efficiently with people like Trading Standards, people like the banks, and to come together and sing off the same hymn sheet instead of them doing this and we're doing that, and that, you know, we need to pull things together.
You've brought me to where I wanted to go next, actually, and we're quite short for time, and I do want to get to audience questions, so I jumped to another question. And this actually, Louise, this is for you. National, you're the Trading Standards, and then we've got Age UK, and then we've got the Crime Watch over there, John. Have we got too many organisations? Is it a confusing picture for people? Where do I go? If this has happened to me, who do I turn to first?
There's two things, isn't there? There's the fact that it's massively underreported, and then we're trying to encourage people to report it, but lots of different organisations are asking for this to be reported to them. So when Katie mentioned the 3 million additional victims that have reported the fact they've been a victim of fraud this year, and that's gone into the national statistics, that doesn't include any of the trading standards data, because we report it to a different central government department.
Oh, right.
So
That's
within the
helpful.
national team, we've got 300,000 potential victims on suckers lists that we share with the local trading standard services, and they go out and visit those victims. So if they come back as confirmed victims, I hold that data and I feed that in. So
And you can't give that to Keith up here, the suckers list, can you?
because we're law enforcement, so the data sharing, which we're trying to iron out at the moment around data sharing, because it's sensitive personal information.
Sure.
But there are, at the top, so where you've got, the Home Office, and we do work with the Home Office for the Joint Fraud Task Force, which is about bringing partners together, financial institutions and other organisations together to try and tackle this problem
And then
collaboratively.
you chuck into that telephone preference service, which people can register with, and all of this.
So you've got three. So you've got Home Office, who's responsible for scams. You've got the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, responsible for nuisance calls, which is scam calls as well. And then you've got BAYS, who are BIS, who are responsible for mass marketing fraud.
Okay, mind blown. Okay,
confusing, yes.
Perhaps we'll come back to that. And something Katie and I spoke about earlier in the week, and this is my last question before we open it up to the floor. We were talking on Monday about whether this kind of theft should be a hate crime against older people. Do you want to just very quickly give me your thinking on that?
Well, I'm not sure hate crime is the right route for this. It's certainly a hateful crime. Because the victims are deliberately targeting our elderly, and they have a larger and larger pool to choose from now. But what I'd like to see is this become an aggravating factor in sentencing, because at the moment one of the aggravating factors is vulnerability of the victim. But unless a victim has perhaps a mental incapacity or what have you, they're not necessarily deemed as vulnerable by the sentencing that's available. And we've had judges in Sussex say they'd like to give stronger sentences. So an elderly person who loses, and Louise referred to this earlier, an elderly person, for example, who loses on average in Sussex, who's a victim of fraud, will lose £13,000. Now, if you're in your mid-30s or 40s, you've got another 20, 30 years ahead of you of working life that you could probably earn that back. But if you're 85 years of age, £13,000 can be the difference to you actually living or not. And so I think this needs to be reflected in the sentencing much more.
One of our other panellists, pick up on that. Who would like to speak about whether there should be a hate crime or not? Or perhaps you don't.
I think there's other things that we can do around in relation to the legislation changes as well. We talked about this earlier, around mental capacity. So where people are deemed to have capacity, it's difficult for us to intervene and stop them from being scammed. But it's those people that have been, for want of coerced continually, but they have capacity so they can function in every other aspect of their lives, but they're vulnerable because they're being coerced. We need to be able to there need to be some legislation changes around identifying that group of people and actually being able to support them.
Hate crime is defined by somebody who is vulnerable, and other categories as well, being picked on because of their vulnerability. Yeah. And so if you're on your own and you know people talk to you on the phone nicely, you perhaps become vulnerable. Perhaps you don't to start with. Perhaps you become vulnerable.
It's subjective, isn't it? So you're not vulnerable because you're old. You're not vulnerable because you live alone. You could be, but you're not necessarily.
Lisa Bernadette, would it help to have this specified as a crime? Because then you don't have to kind of find what line has been crossed.
I don't particularly think that creating new crime types, new categories of crime is necessary. I think what we have at the moment feels entirely adequate, and Bernadette may have a different view on this. But I do support Katie's view in terms of what we really need is a deterrent factor. We seem very willing to change legislation to increase the penalties for using a mobile phone in order to provide that deterrent. It feels that is lacking around this area. And of course, sentencing powers is not something that is falls to the police. I'll carry on talking while we get some answers. So actually, I think in terms of really having the sentencing powers available, which exist to some extent, but actually being really proactive around publicising those cases where really stiff sentences have been given is also really powerful. And I know in force, people will come to me routinely and say, actually, we landed this job and there was a person who'd been exploited because they've been taken advantage of based on their age. And it's seen as the exception as opposed to the rule. And I think what we'd like to move to is a position where actually we have very consistent, very robust sentencing across the piece. And that's a conversation of the past.
Okay. So there's the first part of our evening over. Can we give our panel a round of applause, please, for their contributions so far? And then we'll ask you to vote on a few key actions, so we've got something to take away from tonight shortly. But between now and then, it's over to you. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a point to our panel, please put your hand in the air. We'll bring a microphone to you. Then I'd like you to just introduce yourself, first name or first and last name, if you're feeling bold, and ask your question. So, Ellie, who have you got there first of all? Hello there.
Hi.
Hi, what's your name?
It's Muriel Brio.
Hello,
and
Muriel.
I'm... Nice to put a face to the voice, actually.
Yeah, sadly, it's this face, but there you go. Muriel.
I'm the chair of the North Portside Residents Association. I'm very lucky, I think, at 80, that I've still got some of my marbles here. So, two things. On the net, and it's lucky that Virgin put it into spam, and of course it's these ones from Africa. I've got this $3 million dollars that I would like to put into your account so that I can come over. Now, immediately that rings bells. If you've got that amount of money, why would you need it to come to me to get you over? Because your bank could very easily just transfer it.
So you've sussed that immediately. Why would people fall for that?
I don't know. I think, like you say, vulnerable people.
And
it's someone that they think is actually needing that money, and I can do a good deed.
Is this a question for our bankers here, our money handlers? Is that something? It's a ludicrous request, but some people will go for it.
Unfortunately, they do.
Yeah.
You would think both our organisations have put a lot of information out there on the types of scams and frauds there are out there. On MoneyGram's webpage, right in the middle of the webpage, is a link to a scam awareness site, which tells you all about scams, all the different types, and it gets updated on a regular basis because, as someone alluded to earlier, scams change. The criminals are very quick on working out how, if one thing doesn't work, they'll move along to something else. And we update that website, and all our forms have got fraud warnings on them. And as I said earlier, that our agents should be asking those sort of questions. But there's still people out there. It seems incredible to me because that's. Do people know the expression 419 scam, advance fee scams? Mostly come from West Africa, where you have a huge amount of money, tens of millions of pounds, and you're going to get 50% of it if you allow them to.
So I'm not too worried about you, Muriel.
Yeah.
You seem. Sorry, did you have a second point as well, very quickly?
Yes, it was just one. Actually, it's a friend of mine today, and she was nearly scammed. And actually, she's autistic, but they'd actually got the last 3 numbers off of her bank card, knew it was Santander, and it was only when they asked for the next digits and they said, it clicked. She said, no, thank you.
Okay.
So she had to go then to the bank and get everything changed because how they'd got it, she don't know, because she don't have the card out the same as I do.
So do you keep, do you look after her? Do you talk to her about these kind of frauds? She spotted this one herself.
Oh, she's there.
Okay,
she's got it all there,
good.
really, so she knew it. But,
Thank you.
And also, just
Yes.
sorry, taking up the time. What I do on calls, I leave my answer machine on. So the only people that know, if they know me, they will say, "Are you there, Muriel? Will you pick up?"
And how perverse is that you have to screen your calls like that and your friends just can't ring you first up? Muriel, thank you. So another question just over here, please, Ellie. Thanks. Hi. What's your name, please?
Hi, Lynn Shields.
Hi, Lynn.
My question is for Laura Flack. Laura, I'm sorry I've forgotten your long title.
No, not to worry.
But, basically, my question is, do all the banks have people in the same position you're in and doing the same kind of work? Because one of the things that I would have liked to have done with my bank is actually set certain limits. You become, you work a lot on habit as you age anyway. So X amount per week is what I would take out in cash, and I'd like to set a limit on how much that could be, how much I could limit. My account will always have this much in it. But some banks don't seem able to take those kind of personal limits. How do you work with the other banks to maybe establish a way forward on this?
Yeah, good question, thank you. And, unfortunately, I can't comment what other banks do and don't do, but we do look to share best practices across the board. Lou obviously spoke around the Joint Fraud Task Force. I actually sit on the Victim and Susceptibility work stream, and that is all around financial institutions sharing best practices, working together. So the piece that I mentioned earlier on is around our debit cards. So that does give our customers the ability to be able to switch on and off remote payments, and also to be able to amend ATM limits or maybe stop it altogether. So, for example, if you never go, actually, I always like to go into the branch to withdraw my cash. I hate using ATMs, that's definitely something I don't want to do, the ability to kind of switch that off. So we are exploring other options as well, but that's kind of the personalisation piece, but hoping, well, we do share what we do across groups such as the JFT. Thank you.
Can I just add,
Sure.
Age UK did some workshops with a couple of groups of older people recently, and this very idea that you've talked about came up. So quite a few people were saying, I would like to tell my bank that over X number of pounds there should be extra protection there, or there should be delays on the payments. I know this is sort of difficult for some of the banks, but I think where people want, the customer themselves wants to have these added protections, then we would like to see banks doing that. And again, I think banks are different, and it's good to share best practice, and some are better than others, but ultimately all of the banks need to get to at least a minimum level of protection, because we know of cases where someone is being scammed. They go into one bank and try and withdraw money. Maybe the person in the bank there is suspicious and refuses, but then they just go down the road and go to a different bank. So it's not good enough for some banks to be really good. Everyone needs to be good, and there needs to be some consistency. So I really like your point. It's good.
And that's something we're doing with a British standard, trying to get some consistency across the banks about not just how they deal with people that have been scammed or financially abused, but actually identifying those periods of vulnerability to intervene quicker.
So are the banks taking this crime seriously enough, do you think?
We're moving towards that, yes, they are at the moment. And there's a lot of work around from the Home Office, which has been channelled down to say financial institutions need to do more to protect
They're closing branches, they're giving us an app to do our banking, they can't sort this one out.
It's very difficult, isn't it, from a banking point of view. So for me, one of the main things for me is about identifying the factors. So in the room, who's got a chequebook? Who writes more than 5 cheques a week?
A year?
Well, the average consumer writes 3 cheques a year. If you're 90 and smashing a chequebook, 2 chequebooks a month because you're responding to scam victims, because you're responding to a scam by writing cheques all the time, because that's the way they want you to pay. Somebody should pick that up.
Very poor view of our elders here. They're drinking too much. They're writing too many cheques.
Writing too many cheques.
Laura, come on. Can your side of the business do things well? Can banks help us a bit more here, do you think? Is that something you could feed back to some of your colleagues?
Yeah, definitely. And looking at some of those analytics piece that you mentioned there specifically around the checks, that is something which we are hoping to work on and bring in, because as a bank, we do have so much data, and actually it's how we can effectively use that data to be able to better protect, looking at those pieces around what is actual normal banking behaviour and what actually are some of those signs, some of those symptoms, some of those kind of red flags that we should be watching out for as points of intervention, to pick up the phone and go, actually, you know, Danny, you are writing 100 cheques a month.
Yeah,
is
and I'm
everything
sure it's
okay?
not profitable for you, but I tell you what, it shows
So-
you love your customers if you do that.
You've
Don't you
got to
think?
do it.
Okay. Right, we've got 10 minutes left, so rattling through some questions. Steve on the Facebook page asks this. Royal Mail and other private companies are making money in facilitating sending the scam mail. They actually deliver it. Should they be accountable for their actions?
We work in partnership with Royal Mail quite closely. We work in partnership with Royal Mail and other mail providers.
Right, and are they?
They are taking. There was a lot of press October last year, and there's been a real drive since then, and a very proactive approach to tackling scam mail from a mail provider.
Right, but they're not allowed to open the mail and find out what's inside. Are they looking at envelopes going, yeah, that
You can
looks
tell
pretty
from the
fishy?
outside. You can tell from the outside.
Right,
most of the
and so
scam
what
mail.
can they do with that then?
They
Because they've still
can't-
got to deliver it, don't they?
Yes, if it comes as freight, it's not post, so you're not intercepting it. So there's different. There's ways around it with the legislation, and there's ways that they can identify where it's coming from and stop it at source.
The freight companies, are they interested? If
Yes.
they're right.
We're all working quite
Okay.
well in partnership, collaboratively at the moment.
Here's another one from the Facebook page. Richard said, how would you propose people protect themselves against so-called binary options, which are classed as fraud in most European countries, but not in the UK? I don't understand the question. I just read it out. Anybody? Richard, we'll get back to you on that one. We can find somebody to answer that for you on the Facebook page. Thank you, though. Yes, lady there with her hand up. Good evening. Hello.
Hello.
What's your name, please?
My name is Maria. I'm a local resident.
Hi, Maria.
And I have a question for the lady police officer there. I understand that now the police have a very different attitude to people who are victims of crime. But some years ago, I had my purse stolen from my workplace, and the police officer who came and asked me about it said to me, how was it stolen? And I said it was stolen from my desk drawer. And he said to me, you've been a very, very silly girl, haven't you? And I hope that your husband spanks you when you get home.
That wasn't from this millennium, was it? Or last millennium, was it?
It was the 1990s.
No, that's not that far in the past.
Now, all my point is that a lot of older people may well have had similar experiences from the police.
Lisa, do you want to answer that one, Lisa Bell? I mean,
Not particularly, but I feel obliged to.
it was given to you, so I think you should
It was,
answer
no. And I think it's you know, it saddens me, I guess, to hear that anybody has been spoken to in that way. And to me, I guess, when, you know, you've come to the police and you've asked for their help, it's important that you're treated with respect and dignity, regardless of how something has happened. But what I would say is I was having conversations with people in the room earlier, and I mean, I have 25 years service, so, you know, when you're talking about the 90s, that's the point at which I joined. What I can say 25 years later is I think that absolutely would be the exception, and any individual officer probably wouldn't be remaining a police officer for very long if that's the kind of conduct and response that was given to members of the public. So we've come a huge way, and I think something that is far more common in terms of our language now is about victim care, being victim-led, actually making sure that we are safeguarding people once we've looked at all of the factors that contribute to that vulnerability. And it's absolutely not endemic in our organisation around sort of blaming the victim and making the victim responsible. We are responsible for making the right things happen once a victim has come to us. So whilst clearly I can't, you know, comment on the unfortunate events that you experience as a victim of crime, I'm absolutely confident that the experience of any victim coming forward would not be replicated in the way you've described.
But just very briefly.
My question was, you know, I understand that, but what are you doing to make the public aware that there's been a change?
Well, I think all of the awareness campaigns that we've talked about, I mean, some of the things that I've referenced in terms of we you know, adopt practices that recognise we see certain crimes need a different response. So, you know, I've talked about, you know, Operation Signature Crimes, absolutely attracting a face-to-face contact and not something that will be dealt with remotely. And in terms of, you know, the public being aware, I mean, I hope that by working in partnership, there is, you know, far greater evidence than there ever was that we are really keen to understand vulnerability, exploit all of the opportunities to spot where people are at risk of this, and deliver the best service possible. So I think everything we've talked about today, it's not just a police responsibility. I think we've matured in terms of how we work with others. And just really, I think, keeping up the message and the pressure around the awareness raising and using the sort of voluntary sector as well to demonstrate the commitment across the piece, not just in policing.
Okay, thank you for your question. And another question from the back of the room there. Hello, at the back, how are you?
Well, I've got the microphone, I'm in the middle. Don Campbell, one of Katie's Elder Commission members, much too young for such a title anyway. I was really going to follow up on the trading standards. Louise Baxter fielded the question about the myriad of organisations all competing for much the same victims of crime and elderly fraud in particular. I think the rest of the panel should have a view on how far, accepting the data information limitations, how far they should all be coordinating, because a lot of them are sending out the same message, and it should be the same message, and they should be talking enough to identify routes whereby that same message can go out. The Brighton council tax bill's just gone out. The police tend to have a mention in that for their part of the precept, but then there could have been a leaflet in there from Age Concern simply stating what frauds are happening lately, because the old and the infirm who might not be on the internet, of course, probably all get their council tax bill and probably read what's enclosed with it.
As you were mentioning,